This week on Future Proofing Canada, I'm sharing a recent IRPP panel discussion that explores mission-driven government and whether it can work in Canada. I'm joined by Sarah Doyle of University College London's Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose, Jack Pannell of UK-based think tank the Institute for Government, and Dan Honig of University College London's School of Public Policy. Together, we unpack what mission-driven might mean on this side of the pond. Here's our conversation. Good morning. My name is Jennifer Ditchburn. I'm the president and CEO of the IRPP. The IRPP, if you're not familiar with us, is a 53-year-old independent think tank. We do in-depth research on social and economic policy. We also study Canada's federal community through our Centre of Excellence on the Canadian Federation, and we're the publisher of Policy Options magazine. Our home base is in Montreal, or Tiohtià:ke. This is the traditional territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka. This entire area has been a gathering place for Indigenous peoples, and we note their enduring connection to the land. And I want to mention that our neighbors in Kanien'kehá:ka have a mission themselves. They're building an important new language and cultural center, theater, and a tourism visitors center. You can check out how to donate to that mission at kmpb.ca. So the arrival of a new government often signals a new approach to public administration and to delivering on policy promises. There was the new public management style under Brian Mulroney, which was inspired by the Thatcher government in the UK. Stephen Harper borrowed his centralized communications and message discipline from the John Howard government in Australia. And Justin Trudeau ushered in a focus on deliverology, which was inspired by the Tony Blair government. Prime Minister Carney is very quickly signaling that he wants to do things differently. He set out 7 missions that he would like his cabinet and the public service to work on or focus on. And suddenly the term mission-driven or mission-oriented government is a new buzzword in Ottawa, and we're all wondering, what does this mean? What are the implications? We have 3 brilliant panelists who are going to help guide us through this. Sarah Doyle is a policy fellow at the University College London Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose and a fellow at Social Capital Partners. Previously, she was the chief of staff and head of policy to Professor Mariana Mazzucato at the university. I should note that Sarah has worked inside the Canadian government, most notably inside the Privy Council office. Dan Honig is an associate professor at Georgetown University, McCourt School of Public Policy, and University College London School of Public Policy. These are really long university names. He's also a non-resident fellow at the Center for Global Development and a fellow of Harvard's Building State Capability Program. But today, Dan, you're at Oxford. It's like maximum university references today. And Jack Pannell is a researcher at the Institute for Government, a nonpartisan British think tank, which aims to improve government effectiveness. His work focuses on elections, parliament, constitution, and mission-driven government. Hi, Jack, and I want to say hello to Kash and the folks at IFG because they kindly welcomed me to the offices last year in London, which was much appreciated. And I highly recommend IFG's work around civil services and government, lots of models for research that could be done here in Canada. So I wanted to start off with the basics. Sarah, your former boss, Mariana Mazzucato, the Italian-American economist, is regarded as somewhat of the originator of the idea of mission-oriented government. Can you give us a sort of basic definition of what it is?
Yeah, happy to. It's a word that's getting overused, perhaps, which could be encouraging, but also can be confusing. And it's not about policing what it means exactly, but I think it's helpful to have a sense of what we're talking about that's different from just the word priorities, for example. So the way that I think about missions, the way that Mariana Mazzucato has described mission-oriented innovation policy or mission-oriented industrial strategy is the definition of really specific, ambitious goals that are inherently cross-sectoral and cross-ministerial. So it can be a tool for driving a more collaborative approach to government, which is different from the more traditionally siloed ministry-based approach that we're used to. I think the most interesting potential of emission-oriented approach is in the power of this approach to break down this artificial boundary between economic policy and social and environmental policies. So instead of saying we've got a ministry that's concerned with innovation, private sector investment and growth that's going to do its thing over here, and then we've got another ministry that cares about climate, another that cares about, you know, people's cost of living and well-being, et cetera. And we're just going to hope that those goals don't interfere with one another. This says that doesn't work. We've seen that doesn't work. How we grow an economy matters. We need to make sure that the direction of growth is one that serves the climate and serves people. And one way to do that is by orienting growth around missions that correspond both with a policy goal of the government and with a domestic and global market opportunity. And looking to the UK, I would say that of the missions that Starmer's government has set, only one really aligns with that definition, and that's the net zero goal, where the government is aiming to achieve net zero energy by 2030, I believe, and net zero across the economy by 2050. And they have framed that as both a climate imperative and an economic imperative. It was reflected in the industrial strategy that was just released, whereas the other missions were not. So I think that is the type of mission that is the most promising, the most interesting, and that I would love to see brought here to Canada.
So the Starmer government has set out 5 key missions, and I think the one on net zero is something like UK wants to be a world a clean energy superpower, I think is the wording, right? Jack, we've heard of deliverology, we've heard of agile management, like all these things are very trendy in government over time. So don't all governments set priorities and want to, you know, have iterative processes, circular process? Like what is it that sets this apart you know, from those other strategies that we've heard about before?
So what makes missions different? I would say there's sort of a broader aspect of that, which is one of the slogans that we saw a lot in the election campaign here from Keir Starmer, which was an end to sticking plaster politics. And so the idea of missions was sort of identifying this problem with policymaking and governance in general in the UK, which is partly sort of due to external factors. We had the sort of global recession, then we had Brexit, then we had the pandemic. And so politics and policymaking became sort of moving from disaster to disaster, really trying to fix things and problems as they arose, and losing a bit of the long-term thinking and the long-term strategy. And so the slogan was an end to sticking plaster politics. I think that is a big aspect of the missions at the top level, is a way of actually really focusing and even taking a political hit when necessary to move towards these longer term goals, rather than sort of scrambling to deal with whatever issue comes up on the day. I think we can get into how successful this government has been in their first year at doing that, but that was certainly one of the aims. And then in terms of how government works more on a day-to-day basis, the government has sort of set out a few different ways it wants to work differently, and using these missions to drive that. So as Sarah said, it's sort of breaking down silos between government, bringing in more of a test and learn approach to policy making. Often in the UK, policy is sort of developed in its entirety before it starts being introduced. Working more with devolved governments in the UK, so that is with Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, but also with our sort of metro mayors that we're increasingly introducing across the country. Also sort of trying to be a bit more transparent with the public is one of the aims of missions as well, and sort of using data more openly to really show what the trade-offs being made are and how they're moving towards it. And also really changing the way that the government works with other sectors, be that with local government, with devolved government, but also with the public sector, the private sector, civil society groups, and how government can sort of help society move or use the missions as a way to bring people together from all these different sectors and bring them into the process to try and, you know, do policy a little bit differently.
What are some of the key roles that government has to play in order to drive the delivery of a mission?
Yeah, so I think it's really important that government is driving this very strongly from the top, making sure that you've got buy-in from the Prime Minister and that the Prime Minister is engaged. We've already mentioned that the climate mission is one that's going quite well relative to the others, and I think that is in part because there's a lot of buy-in from Keir Starmer for that, and it is something that he's really engaged with. Making sure that senior ministers are really pushing for this, that they are clear that this is their priority and driving it from the top down. And also making sure that government at the center is putting the right structures in place. You know, it's all well and good to say civil servants need to work better together, but how do you actually put those structures in place? What are you using to coordinate and to incentivize that from the top? Because without real driving from the top, then it is really hard to set direction on a mission and make sure that those changes are actually.
That's a good segue into a question I have for Dan. So you recently collaborated with the British Innovation Agency, Nesta, to create, and I'm going to read this, a maturity framework for assessing organizational readiness for mission-driven working. What can you say about the importance of the leadership style and the behaviors in an organization? I mean, you could talk about organizational missions as well, not just government missions, but today we're talking about government missions that would differentiate. Let's talk about government from being genuinely mission driven versus what you would call mission washing or mission striving, which is a little bit better than mission washing. And I think people can infer what mission washing means. So, you know, on the, I guess more on the leadership aspect or dimension of mission government.
Yeah, sure. So, you know, so thank you first. So far, I imagine webinar participants here just associate me with big, complicated words and phrases. So, you know, but the titles and then the name of this thing. I mean, basically it comes down to, you know, you're using the language of missions, as Sarah alluded to. I think we're seeing more and more of that. You know, are you actually doing anything differently? Because if you aren't, simply using the word mission doesn't, you know, magically make things improve any more than using the word accountability or, you know, commitment or telling the organization to work better or the government to do better is gonna lead to change. So, you know, what does lead to change? Well, things that actually change behaviors inside the system. So, and we can think of those, as you alluded to, at the organizational level for people pursuing an organizational mission. We can also think about them for these grand government wide missions of the style that we're talking about here, of the Starmer and the Carney government. So what does leadership look like? Well, leadership looks like setting clear direction. We've talked a bit about that already, right? Leadership also looks like authorizing a different way of working that can involve the kind of joined up working across silos that that Sarah alluded to most directly, right? It also can involve simply allowing and supporting innovation, experimentation, et cetera. You know, part of the logic of calling something a mission is that you don't know what the right answer is. If you knew what the right answer was already, you just do that. If you don't know that right answer, you're going to have to work to figure that out. And that's going to mean bringing in both kind of trial and error of the sort of test and learn that Jack was alluding to, right? But also a kind of culture of allowing people to try things, allowing people to learn, joining up information, right? Seeing failure in an attempt to do something as a step forward, not a step backwards, et cetera. And leadership can play an important part in messaging that and also proving that that's true. You know, if civil servants in Canada are anything like civil servants in any of the many countries I've had the pleasure of working, they're largely a risk-averse group, and it's not the first time they've been told that things are going to be different now. You just alluded to a number of attempts, Jennifer, in your open, with various governments. And so, you know, what leadership can do is set up those structures and set up that direction, but also signal through action that when people engage in actions that forward the mission, even if that means by way of figuring out what not to do next time, that they are rewarded, that they are lauded for that, that leads to promotions, not, you know, horizontal transfers to whatever the least desirable post is, for which they're eligible. And so, you know, leadership isn't everything, but it is a critical, necessary step of making missions work.
Jennifer, if I could just build on that. I think that we've alluded to this test and learn unit that's based in the Cabinet Office, which I think is really promising and really worth looking at in terms of what the Canadian government should be paying attention to. But I think it contrasts with, and I'd be curious to get Dan and Jack's opinions on this, the return to deliverology that we're also seeing in Starmer's government. I don't think these two things are necessarily simpatico, or if they are, then I'm a bit fearful about the potential of test and learn to actually work. I think that the logic of deliverology can lead to more of a linear implementation approach, where metrics are kind of set up in advance. We assume we know where we're going, and it's just a matter of pushing everyone, incentivizing everyone to get there faster, rather than saying we know what we're trying to achieve, but we don't know how to do it. And so we need feedback loops that are going to allow us to learn about what works and what doesn't work. And what's fascinating also about the test and learn unit that is relevant for Canada as a federation is that it is deliberately looking at solutions that are coming from the community level up. So it's not assuming this top-down approach where Whitehall or the Prime Minister's office and PCO, where I used to work, know what needs to happen, and they're just going to tell the entire system what to do and then like hold them to account for doing it, which is, I think, where deliverology can kind of take us. Instead, it's saying, we've said this is a priority, this is what we want, this is where we want to go as a country. We're going to try and crowd in the support we need, which I know our Prime Minister is currently working hard to do with his counterparts in the provinces and territories. But we're not the holders of all solutions. We need to be paying attention to what different provinces, what different cities are doing across the country that might be adding up to a greater whole. And we need to share those lessons across the country so that others can learn and we can adapt them to different local realities. That, I think, is a really important approach. And I think it's important to differentiate that from traditional ways of working so that it doesn't just kind of sound like a nice addition, but rather could become a radically different approach, and one that I think holds a lot more potential for enabling the kind of transformative change that I think both the UK government and the Canadian governments are aiming for.
And we saw some of that
Yeah.
during the pandemic, right? Like I know there's public servants watching this webinar right now who worked really, really hard, and thank you to them during the pandemic, and did a lot of innovative things to deliver services. And but that was a very unusual period of time where I think there was a lot of license, social license to do things. So Jack, maybe I'll ask you, how do you break the kind of forgive the term, like cover your ass mentality that in government, where you want to avoid the failure of a pilot or an experiment ending up on the front page of the newspaper? I mean, that's obviously people are in a risk avoidance mode in civil services, because they don't want to cause pain to the minister or the deputy, whoever. They want to stay out of the news, and often if something doesn't work, that's what makes it news. So I don't know if you have any insight on how to sort of break free of that risk aversion.
I mean, I think that's exactly right. And I think that is a problem that this government has run into a little bit, in terms of it's all well and good saying we're not going to focus on whatever crisis is coming up. We're going to sort of push forward for these things. It's easier said than done. I think there is a sort of a need for a very strong push. Again, I mentioned this before, but it is really, I think, very essential that senior ministers are constantly pushing for this and really making the case constantly that they set the direction and they do this, in part because that gives more license to civil servants to sort of do this test and learn. We see that with sort of Keir Starmer a little bit, and Pat McFadden sort of talking about this a lot. The other sort of interesting aspect of it, I think, is trying to do it on a much smaller scale, and sort of using these partnerships with local government or devolved government in England to be able to roll out bits of policy in a much more smaller and more localized way, which is advantageous in that the sort of outcome, if it doesn't go well, affects a much smaller number of people, but also doesn't become this big national story. It's sort of a way, and sort of allows you to do lots of different things at the same time. So sort of thinking about how you can start rolling out bits of policy very early to test it before doing that full national rollout, where the consequences of failure are much larger. And just to say finally, I think some of the slippage that we've seen on missions has been because government is not talking about them all the time and pushing them all the time. And so when that sort of comes out of the sort of central narrative of government, that's when you start getting all of these smaller things sort of becoming the story for the day, and sort of becoming the narrative around the government and what the government feels it needs to respond to, because it doesn't have that driving narrative of, we are focusing on the missions are our priority. So it becomes, you know, the small boats crossing the channel or whatever sort of smaller scale thing is coming up on any given week.
Mm. Dan, you have any observations just about, you know, pushing past that culture of, you know, ticking boxes and, you know, making sure that you're not embarrassing anyone more senior to you?
Yeah. So, I mean, the first thing embedded in the way you said it is that you have to push, right? And, you know, the pushing past requires a push. And so it requires leadership signaling. It requires, you know, changing sometimes the formal rules, or at least the kind of expectations, and signaling a change in expectations. It then requires actually proving you mean what you say, that things are different as and when something goes wrong, you know? And I think it also, to kind of link back to something Sarah said, you know, it requires understanding that most of the wisdom and information doesn't live in the heads of the smartest people, even if they're the smartest people, at the top of the system, right? That actually most knowledge exists somewhere else. And so the question is, how do we gather? How do we facilitate? How do we support? And, you know, particularly if I understood correctly, as you shift from a kind of deliverology-based mentality, right, which tends to have a very kind of top-down monitoring culture of compliance to it, to one where you're going to need people to have a kind of spirit of empowerment. I think the only way to do it is to do it, right? To actually start somewhere, to start moving forward, to prove that you're real, and to build momentum, and to think about changing things inside the civil service in the way we might normally think about, you know, building a movement, right? You know, we're trying to change people's understandings, behaviors, and that means first starting with the people who are already excited, and then going to the people who maybe could be excited if they thought there was some possibility. And, you know, if I could say the framework that you kindly alluded to before, that colleagues at the Georgetown's Better Government Lab and I did develop with Nesta, is meant to be full of tools to help you figure out if you're doing just that, if the system, if the culture is indeed changing in mission-oriented, mission-aligned ways.
And I should note your book, Dan, Mission-Driven Bureaucrats, right? And what's the subtitle? I can't recall.
Let's hope I get it right. I think it's, no, I'm pretty sure it's how empowering people can help government do better. And, you know, sort of the principle there is that, you know, all over the world, we've lived in systems that are designed for compliance rather than empowerment, that pull control up and imagine that the right solutions come from above. Whereas for most of the hard and tricky problems government faces and societies face, those problems live with citizens and with the bureaucrats who are closest to them on the front lines. And we should think about how to leverage their knowledge, their wisdom to drive action and drive positive change.
Thank you. Jack, I want to focus a little bit more on the Starmer government and some of the machinery changes that they put in place to pursue mission-driven government, whichever way you'd like to refer to it. But can you tell us a little bit about what they've enacted after a year in office?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say we can talk a bit about the top level of what they have implemented, and then a bit about sort of variation within the missions. And I think it's fine to see some variation within the missions because they're all different, and you don't want to be too rigid in exactly what structures each one needs. They're very varied in terms of, I mean, what they're trying to do, but also how cross departmental they are. So our health mission is about fixing the NHS. So that is quite bounded within our health ministry versus some of the others. So the first thing that the government did, and Keir Starmer included this in his very first speech when he was elected in front of Downing Street, he said they were going to set up mission boards, and these were going to be groups of people, mainly senior ministers, who were going to come together and have collective decision-making power to set the direction of missions and work in a sort of cross-departmental way through these bodies as sort of semi-cabinet committees to try and set the direction for the missions. That was sort of the primary sort of top-level way that they were going to direct the missions. Initially, it was said that Starmer was going to direct that and sort of chair those mission boards. It took a while for them to get set up, and that was largely due to sort of difficulties of transition of government. Labour had been out of power for a while, sort of quite unique to the UK. By the time the boards got set up a couple months after the election, Starmer was no longer chairing them, which I think we identified as a potential problem in terms of direction setting. And then within each mission, they've sort of appointed mission leads within each department who are the sort of senior responsible officers, the people that are accountable as the civil servants for each mission. And then different missions have done different things from there. Some of them have appointed sort of advisory boards as a way to get external input into how the missions are functioning. The climate mission is one that's done that very well. It sort of exists separately from the decision-making parts of the mission, but it is about bringing ideas into how the mission is going to function and helping to develop the plan. And so each mission has sort of started going about developing its plan of how are we going to get to this mission. The climate mission was quite fast with that. They had something by December that government responded to by January. Our 10-year health plan for the NHS, which is sort of the plan for the health mission, only came out last week or the week before. So it's been a bit variable in terms of how quickly those structures have got off the ground. But that was sort of the plan. The one other sort of very important aspect of this, and I think is important for any policy, is the money question, the structures around money on these missions. What the government had said it was going to do was normally when the UK does its spending reviews, which are every few years, they set the budget for a 3 to 5 year time horizon, and they say, here's the money that each department gets, and here is exactly what they're going to be spending it on in terms of what programs the money is going into. They had said that as one of the ways to sort of break down these silos, they would have joint bids where rather than the department for, I don't know, transport bidding just for itself, it would work together with, say, the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero to bid into a specific climate mission fund. And so funding would be allocated towards the missions on these sort of cross-departmental bases to try and sort of break down those silos and make sure that the money wasn't just being split up between departments in a sort of not clear or strategic way. There was a bit of that, but not full sort of separate parts, which I think is a bit of a shame because it was a missed opportunity to really bring departments together through that sort of spending review process and have the departments work together negotiating with our Treasury to try and work out how funding was going to be allocated.
Oh, I mean, that would be a radical change, right? Where you know, money isn't aligned in pockets that are departmental in nature. Sarah, what's your observation with how some of these structural machinery changes have been deployed inside the British government?
Yeah, I think early on it looked promising, seeing the development of the mission boards. And I think to repeat what others have said, I think the net zero, the energy focused mission, that governance has worked more effectively than the others. And I'd highlight a few kind of key characteristics that I think are at the root of those differences. One is, as others have said, that the empowerment from the top has to be there. It has to be really clear. Otherwise, and we've seen this in the Canadian context as well, you can create a deliverology unit, you can create some other unit, but if you don't give it teeth, if no one sees it as legitimate, it's just going to be there doing its own thing, completely disconnected from the rest of the machinery of government. So it needs that backing from the top. It needs to be inherently cross-ministerial. I think, again, the net zero mission it lends itself better to that type of logic, whereas, say, the NHS mission is fix the NHS. It is within its traditional silo. It's not really a departure from normal ways of governing. I would say it's just a priority. Like, yes, fixing the NHS is a good idea, but it's not really about doing things differently. It's just a thing the government needs to make sure it figures out. I can share an example later about a health-oriented mission from a different country that I think offers a more interesting departure from the norm. And I think that those teams need to be focused on orchestrating and removing roadblocks. So again, not the kind of command and control models that we were talking about that are more familiar perhaps, but more about coordinating the system being empowered to coordinate the system and to understand where there are barriers that need to be removed in order to allow others within government and outside of government to advance towards whatever the mission goal is. So I think those are some of the features that have been missing from some of the mission boards that we've seen in the UK so far, and that may change. And those are the features that I would love to see in the Canadian context if we pursued a similar approach. Just to go back to a conversation that you were having with Dan about capacity, I think this is a really important thing to underline, especially in the context in Canada now, where we're awaiting the axe to drop in terms of cuts that are coming. I was in government during the Deficit Reduction Action Plan years, and so I sort of saw what that looked like. And to be clear, I'm not going to make an argument that there should never be budget reductions in terms of how governments are run, but I think we tend to do this really badly. And I think if the focus is on cuts rather than on ensuring that we have a public service that has the capacity and capabilities to deliver against ambitious goals, we all suffer from that. So I would really encourage our government to be thoughtful about investing in building the capabilities and the capacity of the civil service to deliver over and above specific metrics that they're trying to achieve in terms of cuts. And I think you could potentially do both at the same time. But what I saw was more of a an outsourcing, first of all, to a consulting firm, which meant that no one really has, I think, the knowledge anymore of what happened during the previous round of cuts that they can kind of learn from and import into this round of cuts that's coming. So don't outsource to consulting firms. As Dan rightly pointed out, you only build capacity by doing stuff. So the civil service needs to be empowered to do stuff, to do hard stuff, otherwise they won't learn. And this is a point that Professor Mazzucato, who I've had the honor to work with for a number of years, makes in her book, The Big Con. So that, I think, first and foremost, don't outsource, work with the public service, allow them to tackle these big problems, and do it in a way that's not just achieving the cuts where you could lose some of your best people, the most dynamically minded people that might be the most capable of leaving government and going somewhere else. Those are the ones that left early on in the catastrophe that was the deficit reduction a number of years ago. So I think those points are really key, because we won't achieve these things without the public service, and we need the gears to engage between the elected officials and the public service. I've been a bit concerned about the finger pointing that I'm seeing in the UK these days, where I think civil service is somewhat rightly perhaps pointing to the elected officials and saying, you're not giving us clear direction. And then the elected officials are also, with some justice behind it, pointing to the civil service and saying, you're not dynamic enough, you're old and stodgy, and you don't know what you're doing. That's not going to get anyone anywhere. You need both of those pieces to come together. You need the gears to engage, and that requires a fundamentally different way of working.
I want to make sure that we get to questions, because I know there'll be many from the audience. But Dan, maybe your observations about the Starmer government, and maybe with more of a focus on the people culture, if you detected big changes there in approach.
I guess I think I see a lot of variation in that regard, right? So I see some places where I think there are changes, right? And, it strikes me, so, there's some work underway looking at sort of the performance of missions, led by Nesta and a few others. And my understanding of their suggestive findings is that the closer you are to the mission, the better you think they're going. And that's not just because these are the people, who have kind of conceived them. It's also because there is a kind of center of energy around each of these missions, though that center of energy is bigger in the case of some than others. And if you're close to that center of energy, you're picking up different ways of working. You are seeing something that feels like the beginnings of something more transformative, but it has yet to diffuse through the whole system. And I think, my diagnosis parallels Jack's, frankly, in that, I think a lack of sort of greater central signaling of the importance of these things if we do want people to work differently, and maybe greater celebration, to take Sarah's, I think, wonderful imagery of the gears engaging, right? So celebrating where the gears have engaged, or at least either one of the gears is turning in a good direction, right? To engage with each other, I think could do a lot there. And, I do think we risk missions being just another set of buzzwords that has come and gone. And in some ways, you know, the reason we built this framework is to help people sort wheat from chaff and in that sense and say, okay, here things are moving. Let's focus there on what's happening. Here things aren't moving. Let's say they need to start moving before we can make that a fair evaluation of this other way of working and what happens when we change in these ways. But a lot of work to be done in the UK, and I think the sort of central lesson perhaps for the new Carney government is, you know, it's never too early to start, and people will become disillusioned perhaps even quicker than you might expect them to if they don't see that there's real changes associated with a different rhetoric and a different framing.
So just before I move on to questions, Jack, I'll ask you, are there some tips that you would, you know, offer to the Canadian government in terms of pitfalls to avoid as they embark on this new way of governing?
So I think one big tip is sort of be prepared for Donald Trump to be elected, because that is going to completely shake up all the money that you have and what you're going to be able to do. And that's really thrown a spanner in the works. I think there is definitely a suggestion here, or a helpful suggestion is around money. And I think our government has pigeonholed itself a little bit with some of the commitments it's made around spending, around taxation, and really not raising a lot of different sort of money raising mechanisms, not sort of ruling out pulling those levers. And that leaves them in a sort of difficult position when they've said these missions will be our really big priority, but also, you know, we've got to maintain public services, and we're suddenly making this big commitment to defense. And so where are we going to make these cuts? And the missions inevitably do suffer from that. So really, it's one thing saying it's a priority, but really making it a priority and really being willing to take that sort of hit politically in the short term, because you believe in these missions and you believe in the long term that they will pay off. I think very clear accountability from what ministers you are having run these missions, and how you're going to try and sort of have them drive that is also really fundamental to the missions, and also sort of making sure that you, when you're planning them, thinking about each stage of how you're going to get there. And it's not just about setting targets, but having a clear idea of, here is our end goal, but also what are the things that we want to do really quickly? What are the things that we sort of know need to be done and we can do easily to start building buy-in for this? Where are the quick wins, which is one of the things that the government did do quite early on. They had their first steps, and some of that has come through in legislation already. So being able to get quick wins, and then the sort of in between as well, which I think is where this government has fallen a bit short, is what are the sort of things that we're going to look for? How do we set the sort of steps that will suggest to us that we are on our way to these really big, difficult goals at the end? How will we sort of get there, and what are the things that we're looking for as a government that we can point to say we're moving in the right direction?
And what I'm hearing there is communication is vital through the process. So we have a lot of questions. One of them, one viewer asked, what sort of data can be used to evaluate success in mission government? How will we know when the mandate letter's priorities are successful? I don't know who would like to take that one on.
I can start. I think the mandate letter priorities are too vague. I wouldn't call them missions for that reason. To take an example, the UK's energy mission, it's not just become an energy superpower, which is also big. It's net zero energy by 2030, net zero economy by 2050. That's a clear goal. You know if it's been achieved or not. You know if you're on track or not. It's also not overly prescriptive. There's a million things that have to happen, that have to change. There's a million policy levers that need to be used, and there's a million market opportunities that are implicit in achieving that goal. So I think it's a really good example of what a mission-oriented approach could look like, and of the sort of approach I would love to see in Canada. I think I would just reinforce again comments from myself and others on the utility of having feedback loops in place. So counter to maybe a more classic deliverology approach, seeking to understand what's working and what's not at all levels, and learn from that, be open to learning from that, so that iteration can happen along the way. And I think, to Dan's point on the capabilities that we'd ideally love to see in our public service, and that as a former public servant, I know many public servants would like the room to exercise, that ability to try things, learn about what works and what doesn't, be empowered to do that, encouraged to do that, rewarded for doing that. I think that's the kind of environment that we ideally would want to see created.
And if I could build on
Yes.
that, so thank you. So, one way of thinking about data is performance on the specific features of the specific mission, right? In the mandate letter or however else it's articulated. And if we can come up with clear what success looks like measures there, right? And assessments, that's a great idea. Let's do that. But whatever the mandate mission is, if it involves changing the ways of working inside government, that is another source of data, right? Data is not just about the kind of hard performance on the mission. It's also about whether, in fact, the system that's meant to deliver on that mission is changing, right? So, and that involves thinking hard about things like, employee motivation, thinking hard about, culture and climate, thinking hard about mission valence, which is, people's association with and belief in the mission. And, Canada has a wonderful central civil service survey, right? Whose acronym escapes me at the moment, forgive me. And, I can imagine ways of using that and other targeted tools to think about that as a source of data on system transformation as a kind of early warning or early progress system for thinking about whether, in fact, we really are changing ways of working in ways that are plausibly going to lead to those longer term changes and actual success in delivering on the mandate missions.
This is all very interesting. We've got really good questions. One is, could the panelists talk about the idea of, quote, all hands on deck syndrome? That is where the government ministries are already overworked and understaffed and asked to generate vast amounts of reporting to allow for analysis by management to meet budget constraints, while at the same time, they want to drive new mission goals. This is real for people right now. So they're facing like the specter of cuts, find the savings, and then PCO Carney, they want these missions and, hop to it. So I'm sensing the angst from the chat here, but anyone want to tackle that? Jack, I don't know, or Dan, go ahead.
Yeah, please. Yeah, I mean, I'm just, yes. Like, obviously, if what missions end up meaning is in addition to all the things you already had to do, now you need to do some more, that's not going to work, right? So just to state it, right? If missions are working, it should mean, at the very least, different reporting and maybe less, because it should mean we're not necessarily being held to the same short-term output-based things as we focus on these longer-term priorities. I have a paper from some years back which says, whose title is When Reporting Undermines Performance. And basically what it does is it documents that the more reporting we ask for, the worse performance is, particularly for those things where the production process is uncertain and we need to let people navigate based on information they see closer to the ground. And, if indeed missions are just another thing, then they are certainly not going to work. We need a more fundamental change in the system to deliver on missions than what you described. And saying it isn't going to make it happen in Canada any more than it, but just to sort of validate and hopefully make the questioner feel seen. They're right, in my view.
If I
Thank
could
you.
also add to that, just to kind of contrast where I think we've been in recent years in Canada, and I'm not a huge critic of Trudeau's government, but I think his government, in some respects, failed on implementation more often than I think people were happy with. But there was, I think, a culture of announcements. So a lot of things got announced in budgets and speeches. Many of those things then were created in the world, some weren't. But the dots weren't connected, and especially thinking about our innovation and industrial system across the country, it's extremely fragmented. You've got these super clusters, you've got public banks, you've got like all of these like big idea things that got created at different points in time, but none of them are really adding up. And what I would hope is that we could replace that with a more like mission-oriented mindset where we're trying to achieve something in the world that is good for Canadians, that is good for our economy. And all of these different tools and institutions are part of achieving that goal, which means not a top-down approach in terms of like, you know, dictating exactly what that looks like, but it means making sure that the mandate of all of those different innovation units across the country is aligned around a shared set of goals that from the business perspective, just to kind of focus on the economic argument here for a moment, that the criteria that a company needs to meet in order to get support from the NRC for R&D is consistent then with the support that they could get if they're then passed on to the next part of the innovation continuum. Right now, I think companies and researchers and innovators are just kind of falling through the cracks in between all of these different institutions. And the reason I mention that is because I think this logic of just like, you know, tell them to do it, get them to report back on whether they've done it, can reinforce this like announce the thing, create the thing exists, great, we're done, checkbox, rather than having this bigger picture approach where you're trying to achieve something that's a bit more ambitious, a bit more amorphous. It's not just about the output, it's about the outcome. And all of those outputs need to be lining themselves up around that outcome. That's a very different way of working, and it doesn't lend itself to the type of accountability where you're just constantly reporting on whether the thing was done.
Right. And that's certainly, you know, as we study at the IRPP industrial policy, and it has definite implications for industrial policy where it's confusing to know what is the sort of overall strategic ambition for our country. Or I was thinking, as you were talking about, you know, the ambition to have everyone connected to high-speed broadband in Canada. If you talk to, you know, people, First Nations living in Manitoba, for example, they've expressed to us that frustration at having like 3 different departments with different sets of paperwork to fill out, and none of them seeming to align on that broader mission of getting everybody on broadband finally. But I digress. I'll go to another question. Maybe Jackie can take this one. And someone says, we've spoken about how senior leadership can convince public servants to adopt a test and learn approach, but how can governments build similar trust with the public? Are missions a viable way for governments to move beyond short-term electoral goals?
I think that's a really good question. I think one of the key things that Starmer's been quite keen to emphasize as part of the mission approach is being honest with the public about the tough choices that are being made. And I think the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, has also tried to do that as well. And I think part of that is sort of setting these big missions and saying these are difficult and we might fail, and sort of showing that the government is doing that and sort of trying to be more honest. I think there is variable success in how far that has gone, but that's certainly been something that at the very top level government has tried to do is talk about, you know, we're going to try and build 1.5 million homes by the end of the parliament. And in Starmer's speech where he announced that, he is very clear in saying, this is very difficult. I'm not saying it because I think we can definitely do it. I'm saying it because as government, we need to try and do it. And we think it's an important goal. And sort of being willing to sort of publicly talk about that risk, I think is a pretty key element in terms of how the top can try and drive that buy-in from the public. And then also, I think just fundamentally, the missions were intrinsically tied to Labour. If you read their manifesto, a good 2/3 of it are the 5 missions. They ran their campaign on the missions. The missions are sort of bought into that. Whether or not people are thinking of them in terms of a new way of doing government, I'm not sure, but they certainly are thinking of it. The Labour's commitment during the election was a lot of it around these sort of 5 missions in terms of what are we going to do and what you should judge us against.
Okay. Any other thoughts on that topic? I'll come to one more question here, a couple more. Some suggest that because mission-oriented innovation policy is aimed at tackling complex societal challenges, the risk for policy failure increases, making it particularly important in terms of how these innovation policies are designed, legitimated, implemented, and evaluated. What do you think? Any positive practical examples you could point to?
I can jump in on that. I think perhaps just building off of what Jack was saying, by declaring a really bold mission, there's a certain type of accountability that's a bit riskier that gets invoked because you said, I want to achieve this big thing. It's hard. I don't entirely know how to do it. You know, politicians are quite exposed. That's a tricky thing for them to do. But I don't think the risk of failure is higher. I think it's more evident. Like we fail all the time in terms of what we're trying to do with public policies. And sometimes we just keep failing because the personal risks are lower to maintain the status quo, but that doesn't mean that what we're doing is working. So I would just push back a little bit on that framing. But perhaps to use some examples outside of the UK of where I've seen mission-oriented policies work really well because they can in ways that are quite exciting. One example is from Brazil. There's actually a lot of examples that are quite interesting from Brazil, so I would encourage anyone who's looking for more optimistic policy examples to look there. They've had something called the Health Economic Industrial Complex for some time. It survived the Bolsonaro years and it still exists now and it's being reinforced, but it has a longer history. And it's a really interesting example of what it can look like to bring economic and non-economic, what are typically thought of as non-economic policy goals into alignment. They haven't called it a mission-oriented policy, but in many ways, I think it corresponds with how I would think about mission-oriented policies. Essentially what they've done is they've said, okay, we've got a universal healthcare system that is both really important in terms of serving the health needs of our population, and it's also a massive market. We're going to use the power of that market to force the market to be designed in a way that better serves the health needs of the population. And a few things that they've done that help to illustrate that. They've got publicly run R&D organizations that are driving innovation oriented around solving health challenges. They've got a list of kind of defined health priorities that help to focus that R&D and investment from public banks, et cetera, around driving innovation and public-private investment oriented towards solving those health challenges. And they, based on that list also, they engage with global companies, with multinational pharmaceutical companies in a public value oriented way. So instead of just enabling the maximization of private profit to dominate those partnerships, they're maximizing public value by saying, hey, if you want access to our market, you play by our rules. Here's the deal. You're serving our needs. These are our needs. We're negotiating price down and you're signing a tech transfer agreement so that we can build a manufacturing base and bring innovation in country. And one of the things that resulted from that, among many examples, is that the vast majority of vaccines that were put in the arms of Brazilians during COVID were manufactured in Brazil. So they've created this growth driver that is also a driver of better health outcomes. And that's the kind of logic that I think is so powerful. And if either of those goals were being pursued discrete from one another, they probably wouldn't make as much progress as has been made by bringing them together. And I think that, you know, the potential for failure is high because if any of the parts of that system fell apart, you wouldn't achieve that outcome. But the potential gain is so much greater, and it is possible. And that's just one example. There are many others I could point to.
Well, thank you. No, it's good to get the picture because it's not just confined to maybe Westminster systems, right? There's interest further afield. Dan, I'm going to ask you one more question from our list, and then we surprisingly only have about 7 minutes left. One of the viewers asks, how do civil servants navigate this transition from a risk-averse culture to a mission-driven approach, and what signs will tell them that the system is really changing? I like that part at the end.
Yeah, so I think there's no simple answer to how to navigate, right? So it depends on exactly where you find yourself and, what your team, what your unit, what your agency is signaling to you, right? So I guess I would encourage civil servants to be open to the possibility that this is real. That's not the same as saying it is. I have no idea if it is or not, right? But, look for signs that people are in fact putting their money where their mouth is. Look for signs that that leadership is allowing or supporting different behaviors than they have before, right? And think about the things that I think so often that bring civil servants to the civil service, which is a deep commitment to achieving these outcomes. So what do you think could help achieve the outcomes that you care about, that brought you to the position you're in? Is there now more space to try those things? And what would it look like to try them? If you're at a junior level, right? What would it look like to create a peer group of people who feel similarly? What would it look like to point out some of the things that are getting in the way of what the government says they want? And then say to management, can we change these things? Is there a way to kind of put test points to it? Navigating this, you have a career to navigate, which is almost certainly longer than the tenure of the Carney government, however long it may be. And of course, you should have that in mind, but also have in mind the possibility that there is real change happening. And what would it look like? What would that allow you to accomplish? That isn't true now, and how do you lean into that? How do you make that happen? And to sell my book just one more time, on mission-driven bureaucrats, I have a chapter in there which is full of techniques of people that have been tried and successful somewhere from all different levels of the civil service, thinking about ways of increasing managerial empowerment, of being able to accomplish more of the things that they care about and deliver on the public service's laudable missions. Thank you.
Thank you. Jack, can you talk a little bit about leadership and some of the components? I know IFG's looked at this particular element of mission government, but as we get to the end of the webinar, I'm keen to leave some solutions for Canadian viewers on that are working inside the public service in particular on how to execute on this. But are there some elements around the governance leadership aspect that you'd want to raise just in closing?
I guess in terms of governance and leadership, I think one of the things that we IFG really saw after the election was a lot of energy within the civil service about this, and partially that's we've got a new government after 13 years, or 15 years even, 14 years, got there in the end. But also it was genuine excitement about missions, and I think one of the things we saw that was really good was lots of different bits of the civil service taking initiative and starting to think about this and do things to try and drive this change. So, there was a whole collection of human resources in the civil service that came together, and they organized a talk and got themselves all in a room to talk about what does missions mean for us, and that was sort of driven by themselves, and how can that happen in terms of leadership. Another sort of key factor, I think, and again, to talk about the climate mission, because that's gone well, is having a really strong, trusting relationship between the senior civil servants and the ministers in question. Chris Stark, who is the sort of person that's been put in charge of the climate mission, and Ed Miliband have an existing relationship going back to quite a long time ago, but there has really been a willingness from the minister to sort of hand over certain aspects of the mission and say, I trust you, go with this and lead on this, and that has really helped as well to drive the missions and help them sort of move forwards.
And I guess you wouldn't want to be switching the main players very often, which we have a tendency in Canada to move our deputy ministers and senior leadership around and ministers around quite a bit, but I would assume some stability is warranted in this case.
Yeah, absolutely. So we haven't had a major reshuffle yet at all in government, which I think is a good sign. We've had one senior minister resign, but other than that, it's all been relatively stable. I think that is a good sign. At the same time, I think as we get to the end of this parliamentary session, it's probably good for the Prime Minister to assess who's doing a good job and who's not, and then make sure that they have time to prove whether they're up for the job, and if they're not, then maybe move some people on.
Sarah, I'm going to leave the last word to you because you're familiar with the Canadian system and machinery. What are some things that, a couple of things that you'd advise people in senior leadership in the Canadian government to focus on if they want to execute on what they're calling missions?
Yeah, I mean, what I'd really love to see, and I think would really help in terms of achieving the growth ambitions that the government has set for itself. I think fastest growing economy in the G7 is what both Starmer and Carney have declared as their ambition, with throne speeches read by the same person, making the same commitment. No, but I think what I would love to see is a mission-oriented industrial strategy, one that orients our growth ambitions around other goals that matter a great deal to the country. That could include food security. I saw food security in Carney's platform quite a bit. It could include our climate goals, energy security goals, resilience to climate change. I mean, right, yesterday, I think our air quality in Toronto was second worst in the world. Like we're suffering the consequences of a changing climate, and there's a need for innovation to solve that problem. That innovation could also be an opportunity for businesses to solve problems that are ones that not just Canadians have, but everyone in the world. So I'd love to see that type of approach taken in terms of the type of growth that we aim for in the country. And the way in which that happens would be so important. Like we hear a lot of talk right now about procurement. For the first time, people are talking about public procurement, or maybe not for the first time, but generally it's a box checking exercise. You're looking for the lowest cost thing, the lowest risk, and we're not seeing it as a strategic market shaping tool, which it very much can be. Now we're hearing more and more governments talk about the potential of buying Canadian as a way to kind of, in some small measure, fight the repercussions of the tariff war that we find ourselves in. But we could take that much further. We could be much more strategic about using procurement budgets as a way to shape markets that correspond with policy goals. And that drive innovation and investment in line with those goals. For example, we just rolled out a national school meals program earlier this year, and I know the UK is also pursuing something similar. That is not just a necessity in terms of ensuring that kids don't go hungry, that they're able to learn, that we have greater equity in our country. It's also a market opportunity for ag food businesses. And I think we could leverage it as such. So that type of creativity, I think, could be sparked by a mission-oriented industrial strategy that would drive a greater alignment between our supply and demand side tools, which we currently don't have. Like I mentioned, the fragmentation of our innovation and industrial landscape in Canada. A mission-oriented approach could help drive the type of transformative change that I think we need in terms of how we're leveraging those tools and institutions. And just to kind of close out that thought, I saw also in the platform, and we've heard since, a commitment to taking that approach when it comes to defense. So there's a commitment to create Borealis, a new R&D institute focused on defense, and also to create a new defense procurement agency. So there is a sense that we want to secure the sovereignty of the North. We want to secure our borders. We want to live up to our commitments that we've made to our G7 partners when it comes to our military. But that's not just about defense. It's also a market opportunity for Canadian businesses. It requires innovation in order to solve some of the problems that are implicit in achieving those goals. That logic shouldn't just be restricted to defense. We should be bringing that logic to bear on our climate, on our food security, on our housing goals. So that's what I'd love to see. I shared in the chat a report that I wrote with Marana and with another colleague, sharing global insights from other countries, including Brazil, but many others as well, that have adopted elements of this logic in terms of their own policies. And I hope it's kind of a useful source of information on what this type of approach can look like in practice. I would also really recommend to those who haven't read it, and obviously I'm biased, but my boss, Marana Mazzucato, wrote a book called Mission Economy, which was really the catalyst of mission-oriented policies globally, including in the UK. She did some work with Starmer before he was elected on his platform. And it uses the moonshot, the US kind of moon landing as an example of what this type of approach can look like. And I find it's a very helpful example because it's one that is retrospective. So we can look back at all of the amazing innovations that were catalyzed as a result of that goal. But let's not apply it to the moon. Let's apply it to policy goals that matter now to us as Canadians.
Awesome. Thank you. That was a lot there, and it could have gone much longer, but really appreciate you helping us sort out what this means. Thank you, Sarah, Dan, and Jack. And to everyone who tuned in today, I'd like to thank my colleagues Blair Elliott, Cléa Desjardins, and Ricardo Montrose, who were working behind the scenes on this webinar. If you enjoyed this webinar and you wish you could share it, well, fear not, because we will be featuring it on the IRPP's Future Proofing Canada podcast, and it will also be available on YouTube. And if you're really, really into issues about modernizing Canada's federal public service, you should be following my colleague Catherine May's newsletter, The Functionary, and you can find details for registering free. The newsletter is free on the Policy Options website. Thank you, everyone. Thanks so much for tuning in to Future Proofing Canada. Our executive producer is Cléa Desjardins. Our producer is Ricardo Montrose, and our production assistants are Elissa Coury and Blair Elliott. The show is mixed and engineered by Jackie Gallant, who also does our music. If you like what you heard and you'd like to find out more about our work at the IRPP, you can head over to irpp.org. You can subscribe to our newsletters and check out all our latest publications. And if you really, really like what you heard, leave us a review on your podcast app or share your feedback on social media. You can find us on most platforms at IRPP. For the Institute for Research on Public Policy, I'm Jennifer Ditchburn. I'll be back in a couple of weeks with a new episode of Future Proofing Canada.